So what does Jane Eyre of Jane Eyre, Miss Taylor from Emma, and Becky Sharp from Vanity Fair all have in common? They're governesses. Today we'll be delving into not just the basics of what a governess was, but really what was her life like once she was forced into governessing, because really nobody aspired to be a governess, rather it was their last ditch attempt to survive. My name is Ellie Dashwood and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature, history, and writing. If you like any of those topics, please subscribe. So up first, let's just go into the very basic textbook definition of what a governess was. A governess was teacher. A family of the upper to middle class would hire her to come and live with them and teach their daughters from a young age up until her later teen years all of the information she needed to know to be an accomplished lady. She would receive room and boarding and a small salary anywhere between £8 and £100 a year. She was definitely underpaid compared to male tutors that families would hire for their sons. What were her qualifications exactly? She just had to be a lady. She had to be born into the upper middle class, received training from a governess like herself, and then pass all that information on to the next generation. So what did a governess's day look like? Well, it was long, it was hard, and it was lonely. She would wake up, she'd give lessons to her students in the morning, she'd watch them through playtime, she'd sit through them at mealtime, and depending on the family and how many other servants they had, she might be there at bedtime rolling up the little girl's hair in curlers so that it would be curled for the next day. And then some mothers of the household would be super demanding and expect her to go help with the family sewing work. And this is what they would do day in, day out. It was hard work. Okay, so now that we know the basics of what a governess was, I want to go deeper. I really want to talk about where these governesses came from and what their position in society was, what hope they had for the future, or rather lack of hope. And of course, we're going to be talking about some great examples in classic literature for you. So first, where did governesses come from? What was their background? And the answer is that they were ladies from the middle and upper class that for some reason had to support themselves. Now, there's a few different reasons for this, but first, let's go back to this fact that they had to be ladies. Now, what a governess taught was not what we usually think of as school. What they were teaching was how to be a lady, basically, which yes, involved that education like we talked about with grammar and literature and geography, and then of course these accomplishments like music and drawing and dancing, but also a large part of what they were teaching was that air, the manners, the behavior of being a lady, which might I just stop here for a second and refer you to this scene from Pride and Prejudice.
Has your governess left you?
We never had a governess.
The Bennet sisters never had a governess. Now, let's watch this scene from Pride and Prejudice. So, had the Bennet sisters had a governess, the second scene of Lydia running wild possibly could have never happened because essentially a governess would have come in and taught those Bennet sisters the proper way to behave in society. But that's an entire side point. So, okay, a governess was a lady, but more importantly, for the fact that she was a governess, she was without a husband and without a means of financial support, so she actually had to work. Now, how this lack of financial support happened was different for every governess, but some of the main ways would either be, one, she came from poor genteel people. And this was the case for families like the Brontes, the actual Brontes of Charlotte and Emily and Anne. They came from a genteel family. Their father was a clergyman, but he didn't have enough money to support them. They had to support themselves, but they did come from gentility. So that is one of the options. Your family was just pretty much always poor. And so, for example, if you also look at Margaret Hale in North and South, if she didn't have a rich aunt and if she didn't have a rich godfather, then she could have very possibly had to end up being a governess too, because her family was very poor even though she was a lady. The other major reason is that perhaps this girl's family was very well off most of her life, but during Regency and Victorian times, things were very uncertain. Businesses could be lost. A family's fortune could be lost overnight because of bank failure detailed. For example, we see this in North and South when Mr. Thornton's father speculated away their fortune, and then under his control, the mill was lost because of strikes. And so these girls who were otherwise brought up in a rich family could suddenly find themselves poor and needing to support themselves because they don't have a husband. And of course, all of this is assuming that the girl does not have a fortune or a dowry that is safe in the bank that she can live off of. Because if that's the case, a girl could be an old maid without having to resort to getting a job by simply living off of her fortune. I talk all about that option in the video, Why Are the Bennet Sisters So Poor? So check that out if you want to know about dowries and old maids and living off fortunes. Okay, so this is what we have. Governesses, raised ladies, now either newly poor or oldly poor, needing to support themselves. Why? Because they don't have a husband. Okay, so now this is the major, hugest factor, which is they don't have a husband to support them, which already makes them feel kind of like failures because a woman's whole job during this time period was to get married and then to have children. But of course, they have not been able to catch a man. Perhaps they were too poor to do so. But also, during that time period, there was just a shortage of men in England. The shortage was caused by several reasons. One was there was a lot of colonization going on in places like Australia and Canada and America, and usually the people immigrating to those countries would be men by themselves with no women. So you're having this mass exodus of men. The next factor is, especially during the Regency times, you have the Napoleonic Wars going on, so all these men were in the army and then they were off on the continent fighting a war, and then a lot of them died. And then the third reason is men were marrying later in their lives, and some of them were not marrying at all, especially the upper class, because it was just cheaper to not get married. And during this time, it was very socially acceptable for a man to keep a mistress, and there were prostitutes all over London. So men didn't really feel this need to go and get married because it was just such this expense and burden, which left a lot of these girls, as I said, without a husband. So here you have this girl who was raised to be a wife and mother in a very comfortable middle to upper class household, and now because of a combination of circumstances, she is poor and she has to support herself or end up on the street. So now what does she do? She has very few occupational options, and the number one occupational option for her was to become a governess and go and teach all of those skills that she learned to become this lady to other girls. Okay, so now we have this governess and she's living with this family, she's teaching their daughters, but her life is now in this weird limbo situation. As I talked about in the video on being a lady, a huge part of being a lady was not working, right? So now you have this girl who's a lady, but by being a governess, she's working. So what is she? And really, governesses inhabited a sphere of their own that was super isolating and depressing because they did not fit in either world. They were certainly not of the working class. They weren't the servants in the household. And they were not of gentility completely anymore because they're working. But they're too high for one sphere, they're too low for the other sphere. They're caught in between with no equals. So how did this play out in everyday life? Well, a lot of people sneered at governesses. Like, here was definitely a problem governesses faced. They were being rejected by everybody. Why? Well, for a lot of reasons, and it all depended on what level of society the person the governess was interacting with was from. So the ideal family for a governess to work for would be the super rich. And we're talking about the upper echelons of society, like lords and ladies, and also large landowning families. Basically, people with big houses. And there are a few different reasons for this. One is they valued governesses more. That level of family had been being taught by governesses for generations. This was nothing new to them, and they valued their services and knowledge more than the people who had lower status than they did. So, for example, as I talk about in 10 Signs You Might Be a Victorian Era Housewife, the Victorian era saw this explosion of the middle class, and these people wanted to look rich, and one of the ways they would do this would be by hiring governesses. Now, they had never dealt with governesses before. They didn't fully understand a governess's position, and there was several other reasons it was not pleasant to work for people who were newly rich or not that rich. But I'll get into those in a minute. So back to working for the super rich. Basically, it was nice because they valued them. Another reason is because they had big houses, which meant governesses usually had their own rooms, but also their own sitting room maybe. Some of them were able to have company over to visit them, which would be a huge thing for a governess, because usually becoming a governess completely separated them from their friends, their family. They didn't get a visit or really see them ever. And then the third reason would be because people of that status were not threatened by a governess. While a governess was a lady, she usually came from the middle to lower upper class, while the upper class was above her even in her normal growing up. So basically, she ranked below them even when she was simply a lady before she became a governess. And so they weren't threatened by her, just as they wouldn't have been threatened by her had she remained a lady. So a great example we see of this is Emma. Miss Taylor has such a great position at Hartfield, and one of the reasons is Hartfield is a big house, and they are very old money. They've had generations of being taught by governesses. So she's accepted on the terms of being a lady there. And so really, Miss Taylor has a pretty cush setup at Hartfield. So if you look at the lower upper class and the middle class, you started to see more problems with governesses because their houses were smaller. Governesses maybe only had a very tiny room in the attic, which actually put more pressure on her because she did not get to sit with the family after dinner. She didn't get to sit with the servants after dinner. She'd have to go back to her tiny room all night, every night, and just sit there by herself. Because again, remember, she didn't fit anywhere. It was very rare for a governess in the lower, upper, and middle class households to be accepted in. And one of the reasons is they feared her, either as an example of what their daughters might be. If she's working for someone who's, say, a manufacturer, that manufacturer's family looks at her and is like, she used to be a lady, but she's now on hard times. This might happen to my daughter. My daughter might end up a governess. And so there's this sort of resentment and dislike of her. And so that's one of them. If you go low enough in the middle class, what you have is people who are socially below these governesses. This governess is more of a lady just from breeding and background and family history than this new middle class could ever hope to be. And they resented her for that. And yet they were held in awe at her ability to be a lady, and they wanted their daughters to have it. But that didn't make them really like her anymore because she was so above them. And then finally, the servants of the household didn't like her because here they had to treat her like a lady, but she was earning a salary the same as them. So it seemed like this unfair double standard. And one of the major factors of whether a governess would have a good position was the mother of the household she went to work for. There's this big problem of mothers being jealous of the governess because part of being a lady was really not taking care of your own kids, because that's too much work, right? And as we learned, being a lady means not working. So that's where governesses and nannies and nursery maids really came in. But then mothers are still mothers, and they're like, but I want my kids to love me the most. Only you're never interacting with your kids. Why would they love you the most? They barely see you. And so mothers would get very jealous of the governess because, of course, the governess is spending all day, every day with these kids. So the kids are going to start loving her more than they love their mother. This makes the mother angry. And so a extra boost for a governess would be if the mother was dead, which is sad, but we definitely see this in both Emma with Miss Taylor, and we also see this in Jane Eyre, where their jobs are made so much easier by the fact that there is no mother there to have to deal with. And one of the ways that this jealousy would come out in the mother is that they would always side with their children, and they would really sort of prevent the governess from enforcing any sort of discipline. So you have kids running wild, you have kids hitting the governess, but the governess can't do anything because the mother is going to side with the child. So now what I want to do is let's watch this scene from Emma that really involves all of these factors we just talked about, and then we'll talk about it a bit.
Who else have we visited? Oh, the Westons, of course. I was rather astonished to find her so ladylike, as I believe she was your governess.
Okay, so here we see Mrs. Elton, who is middle class. Her family comes from trade. Lady ranking wise, she is not very high on the scale. Talking to Emma, who does come from very old money. Lady ranking wise, she has a lot going on for her. And what they're doing is they're discussing Emma's governess, Mrs. Weston, who is of course Miss Taylor originally. So now here what you see is that difference in respect and expectations of those two different classes. Emma, of course, is like, my governess was ladylike. Why would we hire a non-ladylike governess? This is offensive to me that you would even suggest a thing.
And that the woman who brought me up should be ladylike. I've never met her equal.
Because again, remember, she is of old money. She's very long in the gentility where they respected governesses more. Meanwhile, we have Mrs. Elton being like, oh wow, she's genteel. That's so surprising. AKA, I don't really respect governesses and don't expect much from them. And of course, this is really coming from a place of insecurity because let's just all face this much. Miss Taylor, while we don't know a lot about her background, from her position in the family, we can tell that more than likely she came from a very genteel family of some sort. So that means Miss Taylor, now Mrs. Weston, would outrank Miss Taylor on terms of how ladylike there are. So really the ladylike rankings are going Emma, Miss Taylor, Mrs. Weston, and Mrs. Elton at the bottom. And so we can see how Emma is bringing Mrs. Weston up in her position as governess while Mrs. Elton is trying to bring Mrs. Weston down. And like I said, it was all about how you viewed governesses was from where you were at in society. So next up on the things that made a governess's life hard was the fact that a lot of people saw them as a sexual temptation. First to the husbands of the house, which is why a lot of people, they wanted a young governesses because of course ageism existed, but they also wanted a plain governess because they didn't want a pretty young lady living with them, tempting the man of the house to have an affair with her. And then of course there was the next fear, which is that if the household had sons around her age, that one of them would run off and marry the governess, and they just couldn't have that. Now, of course, literature at the time was not helping the poor governesses out, because there you have Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair running off with one of the sons of the household. Overall, literature was not helping out the poor governess's plight. And we can see the stereotype talked about in this scene from Jane Eyre.
Governesses are a nuisance, all of them. They're carrying on with a tutor or, even worse, making eyes at the master of the house.
Yeah, it was hard to be a governess. Now, how did all these factors affect governesses? Well, it made their lives hard and lonely and uncertain, and sometimes they'd get emotionally attached to these kids that they were pretty much raising for someone else, and then the mother would come in and just fire them, so they had to learn how to guard their hearts a lot. There was always this hope they had of like, hey, maybe I'll find a husband and I'll get married, and that did sometimes happen. We see that with Mrs. Weston and Emma, and we see Jane Fairfax being saved before she even had to become a governess in Emma. But overall, a lot of them just live these lives of isolation and kind of low-grade depression, if not full-out depression, their whole life. And of course, once they hit a certain age, unless they had a family that really loved them and gave them an annuity or kind of like a retirement fund, they would just end up in poverty. By the end of the 1800s, there had actually been charities to help older, desperate governesses because it really was this problem. So how did all of this affect governesses? Well, let's take a look at what Jane Fairfax has to say.
As I have told you before, I must wait until the summer. There are plenty of places which deal in the governess trade.
Oh dear, you make it sound like slavery.
That's right, Jane Austen really likened this to a slave trade. Obviously, there are major differences, but these women lived poor, unfulfilling, very hard lives, not of their own choosing, but because it was the only way they could survive during that time. And how did this affect society? Well, one is the governess figure dominated literature. Of course, you look at Jane Eyre, Becky Sharp. These are huge governess-based novels. And it was actually really interesting because Jane Eyre, the novel, was criticized because the governess didn't just sit there and accept her position and think it was great. There really was this concept during that time that if you were poor and friendless and penniless and living this hard life, that's the life God destined you to live. And if you were in any way complaining or unhappy with this lot, then there's something wrong with you. Only was Regency in Victorian England hard to live in. Apparently you had to be happy about it to make anybody else happy. Of course, this literature also heightened the fear among the the upper and middle classes that these governesses were after their men. And ultimately, the whole system of governessing held women back educationally because their education, not only was it not standardized, but it was not very good. If you had a governess who was supposed to teach you French, but she didn't really know, so she's teaching you in a very poor accent what she thinks is right, imagine how that's going to affect your French, right? You're not going to be very good at it. And if you become a governess, you're going to go and you're going to teach the next person that. Ultimately, women had a hard time advancing in almost any sphere because they were only as good as their teachers, and a lot of their teachers were not very good. And this actually led people to believe that women just weren't smart. It's really a cause and effect situation of oh, well, women don't understand this, so they must not be very smart, when it's well, you never taught them, but you teach all the boys and you think they're smart, but you don't teach the same thing to girls, and then you just assume they're dumb. I also never said these time periods were logical either. Anyway, that's it for our video today on governesses. Do you think you'd be happy as a governess during this time period? And if so, what subject would you want to teach most? Let me know in the comments below, and have an awesome day, because you're awesome.